All right, you're listening to Delmarva Live, 92.7 WGMD, WGMD.com. The 100-year marathon, China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower by author Michael Pillsbury, published by Henry Holt and Company. And we have Michael with us now.
Hi.
He's been battling some cell phone issues. Michael, good morning and welcome to Delmarva Live. How are you?
Helicopters, as I recall.
How are you?
The Marine Corps. Fine, thank you.
Michael, we are here in America used to our government supporting and encouraging governments who are supportive and protective of human rights. How then did China, in such a short period of time, become a world superpower?
Well, China persuaded us to make an exception 40 years ago, and with every successive president after President Nixon, that the stakes in China were too great. Their helpfulness to us during the Cold War was so significant that issues like human rights and trade violations, technology theft, quite a few other matters should not be taken to heart by the U.S. government, that we should cut them a special break. And in return for that, they more or less promised, or at least we thought they promised, that they would become a democracy and a free market.
And that hasn't happened, because you point out that since Tiananmen Square in 1989, in the 1980s, Chinese citizens have far fewer rights today than they did back then.
Yes.
Why is that, do you think?
Some people say it's Chinese deception. Some people say it's American wishful thinking. In my book, what I lay out is it was a combination. I don't think they ever actually promised us that they would become a democracy and that they would have a free market within 40 years.
No, that's a good point. In your book, you outline how the Chinese enjoyed a very cozy relationship with our government. Can you kind of describe what that cozy relationship entailed and how it worked for the advantage, or to the advantage, of the Chinese government?
Well, the most important operation was during the Cold War. The CIA called it Operation Cyclone, and they gave me permission to describe it in the book. I submitted the manuscript in advance. They took some things out, but they let the story out for the first time, that the United States, through the CIA, purchased about $2 billion, billion with a B, of weapons from China, and then provided it covertly to the Afghan rebels, part of a plan to drive the Soviet Union out, weaken the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. It succeeded marvelously. There were several other projects like that involved secret Chinese cooperation against our greatest adversary. So I think we can't be blamed too much for cutting China a special deal in light of this cooperation. Now, when the book came out, Jake, as I'm sure you know, China translated it, but they restricted it for military officers and senior party members only. And I asked why. They had a ceremony for me, and they said, here's your translation. Congratulations. We've got some prefaces by Chinese generals to your book. And they told me, well, it's chapter 3. You say too much about U.S.-China secret cooperation. The Chinese people are not ready to hear this. And of course, when they winked at me, I knew what they meant. They demonize us in their school textbooks and their newspapers. They demonize President Trump, especially over the last 2 months over the trade tariffs and disputes. So they didn't want a book being read by the masses in China that explained this really massive Cold War cooperation between the two countries, especially the CIA and the Chinese intelligence service.
Right.
That's just one of many examples I try to give in the book of this 40 years of cooperation.
China steals, on average, I just saw this statistic the other day, $600 billion a year in intellectual property from the United States. Now, the intellectual property issue obviously is a sticking point with the Trump administration, but $600 billion a year, I can't even conceive how that much intellectual property can be stolen by one country in a year, but that's what the Chinese are doing. Your thoughts?
Well, this goes back to President Obama and even earlier estimates of the unfair trade practices in China. They seem to have a concept, and I have a whole chapter in the book about this concept, that in order to have what they call comprehensive national power, the role of science and technology is by far the most important.
Right.
They tend to play down military matters. They play down quite a few other issues. But in terms of science and technology, they decided, it looks like about 40 years ago, that the secret to their surpassing us, which was an explicit goal, would be science and technology. Mm-hmm. And they developed as many as 50 techniques to do this. And this has been revealed in a White House paper put out just last month with a large matrix that shows the 50 techniques. And frankly, they worked quite well. We had a science exchange program with them. We still do, actually, that requires us, through the National Science Foundation in particular, to turn over all new scientific discoveries in America promptly to the Chinese counterparts in Beijing. We even have a National Science Foundation office in Beijing to do this. So what they can't get through the front door, obviously, they can try backdoor means. And I think they've succeeded marvelously. They're ahead of us in many areas of technology now. And that's part of their plan for 2025 that President Trump has called upon them to cancel this illegal set of subsidies to the top 10 technology sectors to try to get 60% market share dominance for China by 2025. It's quite a bold initiative. And one of President Trump's 8 points, he calls it the 8 points for negotiations with China, is to eliminate that illegal initiative of subsidies from the central government. Obviously, this Chinese trade delegation coming in the next couple of weeks is very good news.
Yes, that news just broke.
They have a way to address this.
I'm wondering what you think about President Trump's approach to China since he took office in January of last year.
Well, he's developing some of the themes that President Obama had earlier laid out. So it's not totally new, but it's also important to know President Trump's book back in the year 2000, 18 years ago, has a long section on China, and China as the main challenge to the United States. He brings up the technology issue there and other kind of challenges from China that he sees as the number one challenge to the United States. So he's developing problems and blowing the whistle on them, you might say, revealing them publicly that China's created. But he's also his own perspective to this as a businessman.
Right.
How do I get a deal? I think he wants a deal with China.
There's no question that he does. And he is, in my estimation, and tell me if I'm wrong here, he's approaching it from a business perspective. You talk about what he wrote about China in The Art of the Deal. But in this case, do you think this approach, this business approach, or the approach of a chief executive or a chief executive officer to China is something that they might better respond to than a politician who obviously to this point, we don't have any politicians that have been able to deal with China to the benefit of the United States. It's all been to the benefit of the People's Republic.
Well, it's not Art of the Deal where he wrote this. It's a book much earlier called The America We Deserve.
Oh, all right. I stand corrected. I thought it was The Art of the Deal.
Your listeners should buy my book, The 100-Year Marathon, by the way.
Yes, I agree. And the
issue you raise is whether the Chinese understand President Trump's techniques. And I think they do. I think they've already been writing publicly that he's a master negotiator, and they're quite wary of him. They fear that the trade issue is only a small part of his agenda, that he wants to start a new Cold War with China. I think they misunderstand him. I think he really is focused mainly on trade and making America great again. But there's the group I talk about in the book is the Hawks. And the Hawks have a kind of paranoid interpretation that we can't make any concessions here in Beijing because Trump will just take further advantage of us.
Right.
And that's what I think is getting in the way of a sort of business-like deal that could be had in the next couple of months.
Well, I'm wondering what you think about the artificial islands that China has built on the South China Sea, in the South China Sea. There have been some concerns that they are going to be used for military purposes. Obviously, that's a sore point. The Chinese don't want to budge on the issue, but clearly those artificial islands are causing concern, especially here in the United States and in Japan. Your thoughts?
Well, part of this is President Xi's personal relationship with the buildup in the South China Sea. He, at a press conference at the White House, he said that China would never militarize the South China Sea. It's China's territory, but we're going to forswear any militarization.
Right.
But then there began these series, as you say, of armed facilities being deployed.
Right.
And President Trump hasn't done much about it. He mentioned it. Some of his spokesmen have talked about it. But in terms of aggressive naval patrolling, where our ships would go into the disputed areas and maneuver and launch helicopters, do things that actually challenged those claims, we have not done that. This is a problem for the hawks in China,
right?
Because they kind of expect it, but it really hasn't been done. So I think that there's a healthy debate in Beijing between the hawks and the doves, and that's what my book is about. It's about the hawks versus the doves, and the fact that a kind of a vector result of these 2 points of view often is what emerges in Chinese policy.
Our guest is Michael Pillsbury. He is the author of the 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. Michael, if I may just ask you, I frequently field questions from our listeners about what they can do with respect to the trade imbalances with the People's Republic of China. And, we talk frequently about, you see something on the shelf, it's made in China, you put it back. How much of an effect do you think the American consumer, the average American consumer, can have on this significant trade imbalance that we have with China right now?
Well, there's an issue of safety and whether when you buy a Chinese product, it's really met international standards. That's what would concern me. There have been a number of scandals over the past decade. The Chinese themselves are very defensive about boycotts. They didn't shrink from boycotting South Korea last year over the issue of our missile defense system being deployed there.
Right.
But they're very sensitive to American public attitudes. And frankly, they're gambling right now that President Trump does not have the support, sometimes even of his own Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, to really press these trade issues. So anything that is done that reaches Beijing's ears tends to feed into their calculations, which I have a whole chapter on in the book, how they measure American attitudes. For example, their textbooks really demonize us. They say that Abraham Lincoln started out with a plot to contain China. It's been going on for 150 years. A lot of these things are taught to their school kids in mandatory textbooks. We've never objected to it.
No, we haven't really objected to much from China, have we?
No.
And that's really the problem.
They're kind of spoiled, frankly.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a couple of questions that have been on my mind. What was it like to work under the great Dr. Henry Kissinger? And second part of that question, do you think there will ever be another Secretary of State like Kissinger again?
Well, I like Mike Pompeo a lot, so you're putting me in a difficult spot.
Okay. I like Pompeo, too. I love Pompeo. I think he's great. But I think...
the thing about the great Dr. Kissinger is the 15 or more books he's written, both before he became National Security Advisor.
Right.
He already had 3 major books. He's quite well known. He was on TV news in the 60s.
Right.
Talking about nuclear weapons, NATO, nuclear strategy, the 1815... concert of powers that was set up that he kind of wanted to imitate. He wrote 3 memoirs about his time in office. He wrote another wonderful book called Does America Need a Foreign Policy?
Yeah.
So his writing, including his op-ed pieces, but certainly his major books, have been, I think, the secret to his success and his legacy. I don't know if you've read his book called Diplomacy.
I have not.
It's the history of the balance of power concept from Venice on, in the period of 1100, 1200 AD.
Amazing.
And he shows how Americans don't understand the balance of power and the need to keep it as a factor in foreign policy making. Criticizes Woodrow Wilson and our approach of too many people talking about values and world order in the UN.
Right.
So he's seen in some circles, as you know, as a sort of a left-wing appeaser who wanted detente with the Soviet Union. But in other circles, he's seen as more of a hawk who wanted more tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe in the 1950s.
Right. Well, I remember one day walking down Park Avenue in New York, and this limousine pulls up, and the gentleman jumps out from the front, open up the door, and out steps Henry Kissinger. That was a shock of my life. He just, to me, is someone larger than life as far as history is concerned, and I lived through that period. And I just think that he's as far as a Secretary of State, and of course he was Foreign Affairs Advisor to President Nixon before he became Secretary of State. I just think he's in a class by himself.
I do criticize him in the 100-Year Marathon, and he doesn't like it. But when there was a line to buy his book on China, he announced, I will not personalize my inscription. I'm just going to write Henry Kissinger, and that's it.
Right.
So I handed my book over to him. They looked up, and he said, for you, I make an exception.
Very funny. Very, 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 very funny. Well, Michael Pillsbury, I know that you're in demand, and you are running around because of all these demands on your time between television and radio. I want to thank you very, very much for your time this morning.
Marvelous beach reading, the 100-year marathon.
The 100-year marathon, China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower. I think you said it's number 4 on Amazon right now. Order it or pick it up today. It is a terrific read. Thank you so much, sir, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, Jake. I hope Henry Kissinger is listening to us.
I hope well, if he is, I do a very good Henry Kissinger imitation. Okay. President Nixon. We'll just let that go for another time. Thank you so much, Mr. Pillsbury.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a great day. That's the great Michael Pillsbury, author of The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. What a great book. He is an amazing guest, and I hope you enjoyed